90% of it is work of complete fantasy and fiction. But what really concerns me about that is that if Simons and the rest of Labour together hadn't commissioned this, they wouldn't have got these conclusions in the first place. But separately, they could have, the minute they got them, they could have said this is patently absurd, but they didn't.
Now, it's a really important story for politics. It's going to have huge political implications, actually, but also for the freedom of the press. The campaign group Labour Together, which helped Sir Keir Starmer get elected, hired lobbyists to effectively smear Sunday Times journalists who were investigating donations to the group. The Sunday Times reported yesterday that Labour Together, which was once headed up by Morgan McSweeney, paid £36,000 to a US public affairs firm to examine the backgrounds and motivations of two Sunday Times reporters, Harry York and Gabriel Pogrund, who they were named as persons of significant interest. Paul Holden is a journalist based in South Africa, and he was also investigated by the firm and sent us this voice note.
I feel as a victim, as one of the victims alongside Gabriel Pogrund and other people of this particular campaign, that I have a right to know what has been said about me, by whom, when. So I called on Alison Phillips, who's the new head of Labour Together, who's a fellow journalist, editor of the Daily Mirror, to immediately discover what happened and disclose everything to me, regardless of whether it's politically embarrassing or not. And I worry that that might not happen because I've already submitted a subject access request last week, and I specifically said, please let me know if you've received it and you're processing it, and I haven't heard a thing. And I think it's unacceptable at this point in time.
That was Paul Holden, a journalist who was also investigated by the same firm. Well, Ben Taylor is the editor of the Sunday Times, and he joins us now. Good morning.
Morning, Kate.
For people who are not fully across this story, Ben, can you explain what the original reporting was about?
Of course. It goes back to November 2023, and Gabriel Pogrund and Harry York discovered that there was a really fascinating secret at the heart of Labour Together, which that they had been raising money for their campaign to install Keir Starmer as leader, by which time, by 2023, of course, he was leader, but they hadn't declared it to the Electoral Commission, which as a political campaign group they were required to do, and this amounted to something in the region of £750,000. Now, why does that matter? Well, they simply weren't being transparent, and it meant that internally in the Labour Party they were able to conduct this shadow operation to get Starmer into leadership and then, as we now know, into power. But the characters involved were extremely significant. I mean, the man who's supposed to have declared the money was Morgan McSweeney, who at the time was in charge of Labour Together. Latterly, the person who was in charge of Labour Together when they commissioned this report is Josh Simons, who is now a Cabinet Office Minister. But the report, I think, caused absolute consternation. We put it on page 1 in November 2023 inside the Labour Party because they felt that A, it was very, very damaging, but B, it could lead to other damaging reporting in the run-up to the general election. And I think that's what prompted this decision to hire what euphemistically is called reputation management consultants, corporate intelligence people, whatever you want to call them, bluntly investigators.
And to spend a lot of money doing so. Ben, do we know the full details of what this company were asked to do?
Well, we do really. We've seen documents that say they were asked to investigate the source, the findings and the funding of the Sunday Times reporting into Labour Together, and also then come back with a report which would allow them to shape, and I quote, an agreed narrative to essentially attack anyone who tried to take this reporting on. And I think this is the point that is not coming across that well at the moment. Simons claims that he was horrified when the report came in and said he wasn't interested in the 10 pages on Gabriel in particular. But I'm afraid that doesn't wash, because what we now know is that people around Westminster, including cabinet ministers, had sight of this report, and they were quite happily to chatter about it to other journalists, to other members of the political class, and in a way of discrediting Gabriel in particular and the Sunday Times in that crucial period before Rishi Sunak called the election. Now, what I'd like to know today, because I find it extraordinary that the Cabinet Office has launched an inquiry into a Cabinet Office Minister. I'd love to know what the terms of reference of that inquiry are. That's point number 1. But point number 2 is I'd like to know who in the Cabinet read that report and why didn't they complain about it at the time?
Well, Ben, to underline the point you've just made there, it's very clear that Josh Simons, who, as you say, is a parliamentary secretary in the Cabinet Office right now, it's clear he understood the implications of, especially the information about Gabriel Pogren, because he removed it before sending it on to GCHQ. So he was aware that there was a section of that report that maybe he didn't want to hand on or for it to go any further, but he was prepared to hand it to people who are now cabinet ministers and special advisors. Can you give us a bit of an insight into the kind of information we're talking about that they focused on when we're talking about Gabriel? Not to invade his privacy, but to explain to people what kind of depth this company went into.
Well, to be honest, what they did was they looked at his previous reporting into various political stories, scandals. They looked at his reporting into the royal family, which he became very well known for. And they drew various conclusions. To go back to the original political reporting that it became well known for, which is into anti-Semitism at the heart of Corbyn's Labour. They made various offensive claims about Gabriel's background. Gabriel is Jewish, and they also looked at his family background, which I found absolutely staggering. I mean, anyone who knows Gabriel will know that he dishes it out to politicians of all colours. I mean, Boris Johnson is no fan of him, nor is Jeremy Corbyn, and I can't pay him a greater tribute than that. And this report essentially suggested that he was a partisan reporter, but worse than that, it started to question his religion and his family background. But then it got worse. It started to make various assertions about his relationships with sources, some of whom he barely knew. And then it got even worse for me and the title when it suggests that he and Harry York were essentially being duped by Kremlin proxies to push information into the public domain to destabilise both the royal family and the government. I'm not kidding you here, and cause trouble for the establishment. Now, none of this is true. 90% of it is work of complete fantasy and fiction. But what really concerns me about that is that if Simons and the rest of Labour together hadn't commissioned this, they wouldn't have got these conclusions in the first place. But separately, they could have, the minute they got them, they could have said this is patently absurd, but they didn't. And although the only reason they gave the report to GCHQ was to try and prove that there was a cyber hack, which they could have done in the first place, but they didn't do that. They took out the personal information, clearly it wasn't relevant to a cyber hack, but disgracefully disseminated this information around Westminster, and also even tried to brief a national newspaper to get them to run the story.
Yeah. Have you had an apology, Ben?
Not personally. I mean, I've got broad shoulders. I mean,
have Gabriel and Harry had apologies?
I think Simons has put out a statement saying he's horrified by the attack on them. But no, I mean, we've heard nothing from the private investigators, bar, I think, a statement they put out overnight saying they're having a look at it. Labour Together haven't been in touch. I mean, Alison Phillips, the former editor of the Daily Mirror, sometimes contributed to Times Radio previously, as you know, she is now in charge of Labour Together, and she has wrote to staff last night saying she's horrified, and she's carrying out an investigation. Well, good luck with that, because she's going to have to ring quite a lot of members of the cabinet to find out what they knew at the time, and I'll be intrigued to see if they respond to her.
Does it call into question, Ben, this government's attitude and commitment to freedom of the press, even when it means they are put under significant pressure?
I think it does, but I think it could. I'm very sceptical about all governments when they talk about freedom of the press. I mean, the Tory government tried to impose a state regulator on us in the coalition years. My fear is as well that this government is still smarting from years and years of sort of resentment, wrongly in my view, about newspapers, and there are elements in the cabinet who would dearly love to reinvestigate press regulation and launch fresh inquiries into the way that we work. It's absurd. I mean, as we all know, the real danger on misinformation is from partisan social media that's turbocharged potentially by artificial intelligence, so you don't even know whether what you're reading is true. And the titles such as the Sunday Times and the Times and other respectable titles in Britain have a more important role than ever before in essentially bringing impartial and crucially accurate information to the general public. So to answer your question, I don't think any politician can really lecture us on the freedom of the press, especially not when they've got this type of skeleton in their cupboard.
Just, Ben, finally, who do you think should bear the brunt of the blame here? Should it be Josh Simons, who is still in the Cabinet Office as a minister? Should it be the man who prepared this report for APCO, the company, the reputation management company, Tom Harper, who is a former Sunday Times employee? Should it be the company itself? Where does the blame lie for you?
Well, the company, APCO, will have to do their inquiry. I hope it's full and thorough. I would be amazed if they concluded anything other than this character had to be dismissed. But I can't speak for them. I mean, I just don't. I just don't pretend to know how they operate and what their ethical standards are. I simply don't know. In terms of Labour Together, well, I mean, Simons is an easy person to target because, at least to his credit, he's come out and made a statement. I find it hard to see how he can carry on defending his position, given that we now know what happened, but we'll see what the inquiry ends up coming back on him. But I do think the real people who haven't spoken here are members of the Cabinet and Morgan McSweeney, who were fully aware of this and were quite happy to talk about it around Westminster, and even tried to get the story going in another paper to suggest that the Sunday Times was being used by the Russian state. Now, they are the people that I would really like to hear from, but I'm not holding my breath.
Well, Ben, I know you will keep trying, as will we. Thank you very much for giving us your time this morning.
No, thanks for the opportunity.
That is Ben Taylor there, the editor of the Sunday Times.
An utterly remarkable, astonishing, scary story.